Good evening, everybody. My name is Dr. Ryan Daly, and I'm from the Oceanographic Research Institute based in Durban. Also a research associate at SciAb out of Grahamstown. And I've been studying Zambezi sharks for many years now, close to 10 years. I did my PhD on them, where the focus of my research was on understanding their movements and feeding ecology. And I've had a fascinating journey over the last 10 years trying to uncover some of their secrets as an iconic yet very elusive species that occurs along the South African coast. So I'm just going to tell you a few stories this evening, and hopefully it's of interest to all of you. So to start, I guess, why sharks? When I started my PhD 10 years ago, sharks were threatened. Zambezi sharks have been vulnerable, classified by the IUCN as such, but only over the last 5 years, many more species of shark and rays have become classified as endangered or critically endangered. Indeed, many species that we get commonly along the South African coast only in the last 3 years have become classified as critically endangered, just really highlighting how vulnerable many sharks and rays are. And as a group, in comparison to many others, they are a large proportion of them are at risk of becoming extinct. So that's a sort of a good starting point of why we want to study sharks and improve their conservation. So Zambezi sharks, what are they? They are also known as bull sharks around the world. So if I switch between calling them bull sharks or Zambezi sharks, it's the same thing. Zambezi sharks, because of their occurrence in the Zambezi River, globally, they were thought to be separate species that occurred in rivers in Nicaragua or the Swan River in Australia before they figured out they were one species that occurred around the world. And they've got a unique tolerance for fresh water. They adapted physiologically to withstand fresh water, so occur in rivers around the world and can in fact spend many years in completely fresh water and have been found over 3,000 kilometers up the Amazon River in Peru. So yeah, an incredible species and unique in the sense of being able to go between this interface of fresh and seawater. So why we want to study Zambezi sharks? Specifically because they are vulnerable, as I mentioned. They're these large, long-lived top predators that can take up to 20 years to reach sexual maturity, after which they only pup about every second year, maximum of about 13 pups. So they have the same reproductive strategy as many long-lived mammals. They remain very vulnerable to overfishing, habitat loss, and their population has shown a significant decline, which I'll talk about soon, along our coast over the last 50 years. And they're also of interest because of their interactions with humans. They are one of the species that have been known to bite people over the years. And so the management and conservation and the balance thereof remains of interest and important to all of us. So here's some gray looking graphs, which I'm going to just skim through quite quickly, but there's only a few small take-home messages here. Originally, we found out all that we know about Zambezi sharks on the South African coast from shark net catches. In the 50s, there was a spate of shark attacks in KZN where 6 people died in December called Black December. And there was this huge motivation to put shark nets out to reduce the number of sharks on our coast and prevent shark attack. So this first graph here with the red circle is an example of what happened to the population of Zambezi sharks, or at least the catch rates of Zambezi sharks on our coast. They were catching huge numbers when they put the nets in at first, and this quickly dropped within the first couple of years. There was a significant decline in catches. So what we learned from that is that they are extremely vulnerable to being fished out, and the shark net program worked because it reduced the number of sharks on our coast and continues to do so. What they also found out then was that there were much more catches of these Zambezi sharks in summer and much less in winter. So a lot was found out about Zambezi sharks along our coast from the 50s up to the 90s, from catching them and dissecting them, understanding what they eat, when they get caught. But there remains a lot of questions that was not able to answer. So, for example, if you catch a shark at one site, they die. We don't know how long these sharks may return to that same site. Could be randomly occur at one site and never come again. But if we kill them, we don't know. So one of the big questions that remains after all of this is, do they return to the same site year after year? We also don't know how specific these sharks are. So do they visit the exact same beach every year, or do they just randomly pass by the same beach every year? And then we know that they weren't in South Africa as much in winter, but where do they go in winter if they're not in South Africa? And finally, then, why do these sharks show preference for these particular places? So this is sort of just the backdrop of the background of where we've come from, and we're going to try and unpack some of these questions and answer them going forward. So to start, studying these sharks is not easy, and only in the last 20 years or so has there been the technology available to really understand where these sharks go. This is a photograph that I took of an adult Zambezi shark, and if you look closely there on the shark's, next to the shark's dorsal fin, over here is an ORI tag. So that's a tag, that's little yellow marker that just shows that we've caught it and it's got a number on it. So if another angler catches the shark again, it's got an ID number that comes back to us so we can identify it. And this is a pop-up satellite tag trailing off its dorsal fin over here. That basically gets fixed to the shark and is pre-programmed to pop up after 180 days and collects data on the shark's temperature, depth, and movement. We have to use this type of satellite tag on Zambezi sharks because they don't come to the surface. So typically a satellite tag on an animal on land would work because it's got satellite signal, but underwater you don't get that. And because these sharks don't come to the surface very often, we have to use these pop-up satellite tags, which are limiting because we only get 180 days plus or minus of their movement and habitat use. So we've put out over 30 of these tags over the years, and I'll tell you a bit more about that. And then we also rely on other unique technology. This is a Zambezi shark with a camera tag attached to it. This records video of what the shark does, but also depth, temperature, and activity. So we really have to use all of the tools in the toolbox here to try to understand what these sharks do. But most importantly, we also, once we've caught the shark, fit it with an internal long life acoustic tag, which pings a unique ID signal. And that then gets picked up by underwater receivers, which we maintain along the coast. And the benefit of this is that the shark gets detected for up to 10 years. So we use a combination of this technology, short-term satellite deployments, and long-term acoustic tag deployments to understand where these sharks go. Like I say, we have to maintain receivers to understand where these sharks go, and these black pins over here along the coast, all these little black pins represent receiver sites, so where these sharks could be detected all the way up into Mozambique. And this has grown a lot recently, and through a central database in South Africa called the Acoustic Tracking Array Platform, run out of Grahamstown, we coordinate all of this data. So if someone else has got a receiver down in Cape Town here, they collect the data for us and then they share it. And we collect data for other people and we share it amongst this big community. For this study specifically, we tagged animals mainly the Bazruto National Park, the Ponta de Oro Pastoral Marine Reserve in southern Mozambique, down in the Breda River, and a few other sites along the coast. So again, another pretty confusing study site map, but the focus of our study was in Ponta de Oro, so southern Mozambique, where we have this aggregation sites of Zambezi sharks. And we focused a lot of our fine scale understanding about what they're doing here in Ponta de Oro, and I'll talk more about that coming up. So what do we get when we tag these sharks? Well, a lot of messy information. So I don't expect anybody to understand this. This is just representative of the detection data. So what we want to do now, these red squares represent sharks that seem to sort of represent these interesting patterns of presence and absence year after year after year. So this is 7 years of these sharks' movement data. And I think that just represents something really interesting, because 7 years is a long time to track an animal. And we've only starting to understand what these sharks are doing over this period of time. And I'm just going to focus on a few small stories out of this, all of this data. So coming back to the first question here is when we look back at the shark net catches, we saw that they weren't around in winter. And when we tagged them, we found the same thing, that they primarily are at study sites that we looked at in summer. There's a peak in summer and a dip in winter. So that means that they are there for something specific. And in winter, it means that something else is pushing them away from the site. What does this graph show? Well, this is one shark. And just briefly, if we look at this line represents seasonal temperature. So in August, we have the coolest temperature. In January, you've got the warmest temperature. Each of these blue lines represents 1 year. So this is one shark, year 1, 2, 3, and 4. And every year, the shark was present, represented by the blue line, mainly in summer, and absent in winter. August to September, it's absent. And then every year, it repeats something similar. But how specific are these patterns of residency at our study site? So if we look at year 2 here, the shark departs the study site 19th of July and arrives 3rd of November. The next year, it departs 24th of June and arrives 31st of October. The next year, it arrives on exactly the same day to the previous year. So these sharks are really not moving randomly at all, but instead seem to be cued into something very specific at a certain place at a certain time. So this brings a question, why are they doing this? What's driving them to arrive after a few months of absence at one specific place on exactly the same day of the year? So the next question is, where do they go in winter? So this is a little animation I'm going to talk through, but this represents 2 different sharks, one in that sort of pink and one in sort of turquoise, moving along the coast. So when we first started tagging these sharks, they were thought to be very resident, not really move very much. But we can see this is 7 years of bull shark or Zambezi shark movement along the coast, represented by 2 individuals. And from our main study sites in southern Mozambique, these sharks are migrating massive distances. Every year, they're clocking easily over 5,000 kilometers as they go north to Bazaruto in that August-September period where they're not at our study sites, and south all the way to Port Elizabeth in the peak of summer in approximately February, March. So there's a very distinct seasonal pattern, and there's very significant movements along the coast representing thousands of kilometers. Year after year, these sharks do something similar. So why are they doing this again is the big question. So the other big question we had was, well, up to about 2015, we've only tagged sharks at one site. So we wanted to tag sharks at other sites. And one of the main study sites that we wanted to look at was the Breda River down in the Western Cape. This is because it's right at the end of their range. So typically, Zambezi sharks are tropical or subtropical species, and the Breda River represents a massive range extension in a very cool to temperate environment. So are these sharks doing exactly the same thing as all of our other sharks from southern Mozambique? So we went down there and we tagged a number of these sharks, all adults in the Breda River, and they're there in the peak of summer. And we put satellites and acoustic tags on them. So what do these sharks do? Well, when we tag them down in the Breda River there, which you can see in this red and orange, right down at the Breda River, we were really amazed. This represents the tracks, the satellite tracks of 4 adult sharks that we tagged. And incredibly, all of these sharks at about the same time of year all moved up to northern Mozambique, which we were pretty blown away by. And the craziest thing is that they returned to the same site the next year. So they did over 6,500 kilometer round trip from northern Mozambique to the Breda River. And it's difficult to get your head wrapped around this, but I think for me, one of the things that really just highlighted the significance of these migrations was we tried to collect the satellite tags that popped up. So one of the tags popped up here in central Mozambique and then washed ashore. And we got the position of the satellite tag, and we went to go and try and find it. Now, driving from the Breda River in the Western Cape through South Africa, through southern Mozambique to central Mozambique to try to find this tag was an incredible journey and took us to a very remote part of the coastline. And to say that the contrast was vast between the Western Cape and central Mozambique is an understatement. Really, these are very different habitats, and just really drove home for me how these sharks traverse such incredibly vast and different habitats, and also highlights how these sharks are incredibly important to link these disparate habitats along our coast as top predators. So it really represents a significant migrations along the coast. I'm going to then come back to this question that I had of why are these sharks showing up at specific places at such specific times in between migrating thousands of kilometers. And we started to get an idea of why they were doing this in southern Mozambique a number of years ago, when we also started to tag these fish called GTs, or giant trevally, also a top predatory fish. We were fortunate enough to find that these fish were indeed spawning at the site that these bull sharks occurred at. And when we tagged these GTs, these fish here, we found that their arrival at the study site was so specifically linked to the phase of the moon at a particular time of year. So these GTs show up at the study sites at the first full moon of spring. And like clockwork, they time their aggregation to the phase of the moon during spring. And we were blown away when we looked at the data, because often when collecting data, one needs to analyze it to see a pattern, but the pattern that this showed was just immediately right in front of us. And we saw that the bull sharks were cued into the arrival of these fish, which were themselves cued into the lunar phase because they aggregate to spawn. So foraging is certainly one of the main things that seem to drive the bull shark's presence and specific arrival time every single year. So that was an incredible sort of discovery that came together after many years, but still begs the question, how do they coordinate this? And that remains a big question that we don't exactly know. But this is just a photo here showing how all of these sharks arrive at the same time to feed on these giant trevally and other things too. There's still some things we don't understand about it, but this is certainly one idea. And so at the study site, we wanted to try to film what the sharks are doing themselves, because a lot of what they do happens at night, and they're elusive at the best of times. So this is just a quick video of a shark that we fitted with a camera tag. So this is a view from the shark's dorsal fin looking ahead, and it shows here filming another Zambezi shark. So this is just the first sort of understanding into what these sharks do together. Are they socializing, or are they both of these sharks just there to feed? So this is just a quick glimpse into what the life of a bull shark looks like. But this is ongoing research, and we hope to unpack a lot more about the questions about why they show up at specific times of places and are they associated with this fish aggregation. So coming back to another more recent story, we have St. Lucia estuary here in KZN. And the reason I'm sort of segueing straight into St. Lucia here is because this little story really highlights how bull sharks occur at specific times of places, at specific times of year, and how important sites are for them, such as fish aggregation. But one of the other main drivers of their movements are for breeding. So one of the other reasons that they migrate massive distances, we think, are to breed, to mate, and to pup. And this is because they rely on specific nursery areas, specifically estuaries, for their pups to grow up in and shelter for a number of years before they move out into the open ocean. And remarkably, there aren't many suitable estuaries along our coast for Zambezi shark nurseries, but St. Lucia remains the biggest one. It's literally 80% of all the estuary area in KZN, but St. Lucia has been closed for over a decade. Indeed, since about 2002, there was a long period of drought and the estuary didn't close, and there's been almost a century of estuary management, which I won't go into. But needless to say, it used to be an exceptionally important nursery area for Zambezi sharks. But over the last decade or more, it hasn't been, and we're not sure what the status of sharks in the estuary are anymore. So on the 6th of January this year, the estuary was breached open, and very soon afterwards, these little pups showed up. In fact, we were there on the 16th of January. So only 10 days after the estuary opened, we found this pup. So over a decade, the estuary was closed, but as soon as it opened, the first day that it opened, an adult Zambezi shark was in the mouth. And within 10 days, that adult shark had pupped. So this represents just an incredible pupping event after such a long period of closure. And we do know that these sharks they exhibit this natal phylopatry, meaning that they probably give birth or pup at the same sites that they were pups. So this shark could have pupped after being a pup itself. Possibly 40 years later, the shark came back to its nursery site to pup. So we wanted to know what is going to happen to these pups. So we tagged 9 of these pups with really tiny tags, and we set up receivers around the site, and we wanted to know, are these sharks going to recruit into St. Lucia? Is St. Lucia going to once again become an important nursery site for these pups? And when we tagged this pup, we had no idea what was about to happen, but while we were tagging one pup, another pup was swimming up the estuary, and a pretty large crocodile got hold of this pup and ate it. And it was an incredible event to see, and just represents, I guess, the coming together of this top freshwater predator and this top ocean predator. But the interface at the mouth allowed these two top predators to come together. And yeah, I guess it was sort of once in a lifetime. As the crocodiles came down St. Lucia system to the mouth, they were just scavenging and feeding on whatever was around, and the sharks were pupping at the same time. And so this is just a series of photographs that a friend took where we were there, showing how the crocodile ate this pup. And so I guess, yeah, who's eating who is the top predator here? But certainly all top predators have their own challenges and can be prey themselves at one stage. But luckily, not all of the sharks got eaten by crocodiles. And we set up these underwater receivers in the system to confirm whether or not these pups were indeed recruiting up into the estuary. And the estuary remained open until early June when it closed. And approximately on about the day it closed, 4 pups at least that we tagged recruited right up into St. Lucia estuary. So this was really positive news because it confirmed that sharks and probably other fish too did indeed recruit back into the system, which is a good sign. And hopefully the population comes back and the ecological sort of integrity of the system improves, but we will wait to see more about that. But certainly highlighted how important St. Lucia estuary is. So I'm just going to wrap up briefly now by saying, you know, so what we did all this research, what did we find, and why does it matter? So we do know that these sharks, you know, exhibited these very clear patterns in habitat use. So they come back to the same site at the same time of year, meaning that they are very vulnerable and that these sites are extremely important. And we need to ensure that these specific sites that are important to them, whether it be for foraging or for mating and pupping, are protected. We also know that these sharks exhibit repeated patterns in residency, site fidelity, and they also cross the border frequently. So as you saw on that map, they're going from South Africa to Mozambique every single year, year after year. So they remain vulnerable to threats that happen in Mozambique and South Africa. And indeed, we've had a couple that gone across to Madagascar. So they remain vulnerable to threats throughout our region. And we need to really improve our transboundary regional management plans for these species. And again, just to reiterate how specific these sharks seem to be, they're not just randomly swimming along our coast. So we can focus our conservation efforts on particular times and places to ensure that we conserve these sharks. And finally, the nursery areas remain exceptionally important for these sharks along our coast. And there aren't that many nursery sites. Estuaries have declined in the quality and habitat over many years along our coast. So we need to ensure that the good estuaries we have left are protected and they can continue to function as important nursery sites for the species. So just want to say thank you to everybody and Conservation Leadership Africa for having me, and thanks for everybody for listening. If you'd like to get more involved in some of what we do at the Oceanographic Research Institute, you can look at our website, RE Tag, where we run a program where citizen scientists can tag fish and give us the information and hopefully understand more about sharks and fish and rays along our coast. Otherwise, you can find me at African Shark Diaries. And yeah, I'd just like to thank all of our collaborators that made this research possible. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Ryan for the interesting talk. I just want to ask Ryan if the important sites, is there any monitoring, environmental monitoring of the important sites where the sharks go to? And the second question is, you know, global warming impacts on species interactions, phenology, dependency, like the timing of events such as the ones that he showed in this talk. How do you think, what are your thoughts basically about the threats of climate to sharks? Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. It's a great question. And climate change comes with a lot of unknowns, but I think the one thing that we do know is climate change may impact species at the end of their range. And coming back to an example of the Zambezi sharks on our coast, the Breda River is right at the end of the Zambezi sharks range in South Africa because it's typically too cold for these more tropical species, but there's obviously a good incentive for these sharks to go down there. But it is right at the end of the environmental range, and they only occur there at very specific temperatures at a certain time of year. And I think with climate change, we could see a change in the limit that these sharks are able to access, or it could expand the range along our coast. But certainly the populations living at the edge of their environmental tolerance will probably see the most change. And as you said, it's important to monitor the environments of these key sites. And there are several collaborators at many of our sites, specifically looking at temperature. The guys from international platforms such as Scion contribute to this a lot, but we wait to see what these changes might be, and we certainly need to keep a close eye on it.
Thanks, Ryan. Hippo Zoridis asking you to unmute.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ryan, for a great talk. Appreciate it. Tell me, are you in any way involved with any studies regarding Houndspy and what's going on down there with those sharks, quote, disappearing?
No, several colleagues work on the white sharks down there. And yeah, they'd be much better able to answer the question there. But the Zambezi sharks certainly are not involved with the Houndspy episode. And I know that orcas certainly have been one factor influencing the white sharks distribution. And luckily, the orcas haven't decided to start eating the Zambezi sharks.
Oh, so they do avoid the Zambezi sharks.
Well, we don't know, but certainly I don't know of any records of them eating Zambezi sharks.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Hippo. So, thanks, Ryan. Are there any of your colleagues on tonight that you would like to ask to unmute and maybe have a comment on this?
I don't see any of my white shark colleagues online here. Is there anybody?
Just put up your hand and then...
Enrico was on earlier. I'm not sure if he's still
Yes,
here.
Enrico would be a good one too. I did see him earlier. I don't see him anymore though.
Enrico, I have you here. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you for putting the
Spotlight's on you now.
I was here to listen, not to yeah, there's definitely for Houndspy in particular, there's a colleague of ours, Alison Towner, is doing her PhD in Houndspy, and there is the impact of the orcas that have killed several white sharks, in particular from 2017 onwards. However, there's also a possible lack of resources that have moved in particular from False Bay and Houndspy have moved the white sharks away. But there's a very difficult data. One of the most difficult things to prove in science is the why something happened. It's easier to describe something is happening rather than why. But most likely, as in many other things, is a few factors contributing to something in nature. However, with the orcas, we can't do anything about it. We don't need to do anything about it. What we can do something about is trying to conserve the prey of the white sharks in the areas, and in the hope that they will come back. I try to be as politically correct as I can now here.
Thank you.
Enrico's from Mossel Bay, so he's hoping that all the white sharks come to him.
Actually, I moved to the Breeder River, actually.
Thanks, Enrico. Ron, we can carry on with the other people who've raised their hands
up. Let's give Andy. Andy, there you go. Let's ask you to unmute. There we go.
Yeah, it worked. Ryan, thanks very much for the talk. This kind of links to the previous discussion. I just wondered, when you were looking at reasons for migration and movement, whether there was any sort of look at what other predators are doing that might be, either prey on the bull sharks or, competition for food, all that sort of stuff. So it's a massive area to look at, and I just wondered if you thought about that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question again. Certainly a difficult one to answer. It was really interesting when we tagged the potential prey of the Zambezi sharks and looked at how their aggregation was linked to the Zambezi sharks' timing of their arrival. It was amazing, and I'm sure there's so many other linkages to prey, associated predators, competition, etc. We've tagged many other associated species at the same study site, so they share the same site with tiger sharks, for example, blacktip sharks, and I think there's a lot of interesting interactions between them. It's just so much data that we hope to dig through over the next while.
Thank you very much.
I'm just going to ask Marty, before I get to you, Hippo, do you have a question again?
Okay, I got it. Thank you.
Okay, pleasure. Cool. Wonderful. Marty, let's go to you. Hello, how are you doing?
Good news. Thanks, Ryan, for a very interesting talk. And good to hear that you're a surfer, but you still go shark investigating. And I hope you can educate all the surfers to love the marine life as well. So good job there. I was just interested. I mean, you had that animation that you showed us, which recorded the shark movements, and then you sort of alluded to satellite trackers as well as the tag per se, which is like a transponder and whatever. How much money have you got invested in Zam cams, tags, satellite trackers, everything on the sharks, the trevallies? I mean, it must be huge to get all that information. I'm just intrigued, you know, technology, how much that's helped you to be able to follow this stuff, find out.
Yeah, oh, it's massive. One of those pop-up satellite tags cost about $4,500, and we've probably put out in rands 2 million rands. This is largely through collaborations, international collaborations, specifically with IRD, but acoustic tags, we rely a lot on South Africa ATAP network to support us with that. I mean, receivers, $2,500 of tags, a few $100. Yeah, it adds up to millions and millions of rands, probably more. The camera tags, 12,000 euros, it adds up and up and up and up. And we would never be able to do it without a lot of collaborators and sort of boermaka plan style in South Africa, where we're lucky enough to have a lot of the sharks, and a lot of expensive tags fall off the desks of those in Europe, the States, and Australia, and seem to land in our hands, and we make best use of them as we can.
Okay, I mean, I've got a fishing friend who goes out on a ski, and he's forever tagging, but I just thought that was like a little tag, you know, that it had if it was re-caught. But how many of those actually have the sort of transponder in them?
Zambezi sharks, we've done about 58 on the South African coast, and then we'll expand that more in Mozambique with various collaborators. So over 60 Zambezi sharks have these little acoustic tags. That's acoustic tag. This is sort of the receiver, what it looks like. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So that tag is picked up by this receiver. There's a growing network of these receivers along the coast, which is key to pick up these acoustic tags. So there's hundreds of these along our coast now. We also rely heavily on partners to collect the data and share it with all of us. And then the little spaghetti tags, or also known as ORI tags, that recreational anglers can get from ORI. There's thousands and thousands of those out there, and they continually provide a great incentive for anglers out there to catch and release and become citizen scientists themselves. So that also plays an important role in our understanding of what these sharks do.
But that only kind of is effective if it's recaptured and then recorded and whatever, or found dead, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Deaths or something like this. And
yeah.
Have you been able to get a bit like an estimate of the actual population of the sharks from all of these different things?
Yeah, it's a good question. We haven't been able to get a complete population estimate, but what we do know is that we're seeing the same sharks at the same sites year after year after year after year. So I think it suggests that this population is relatively small, and only a few individuals are coming back to the same sites every year. So my gut is that it's not a very large population.
Cool. And I see there's no other hands up, so if I can indulge you with one more.
Carry on.
And I hope you didn't cover it. I did miss the first few minutes, so if you did, you can tell me to shut up. I'll listen to the recording. The actual name of Zambezi shark versus bull shark, I'm quite intrigued. I heard that they actually first identified the species up the Zambezi River, which is fairly far. I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more background info on that. I'd be very interested.
Yeah.
I hope you haven't said it already.
No, yeah, I'll elaborate a bit. So Zambezi shark, because it was known from the Zambezi River, but then in Australia, it was known as the Swan River shark, found in the Swan River. In Nicaragua, it was known as the Nicaragua shark, and they were thought to all be different species. There was also the Ganges River shark in India. So essentially, it was a global species that occurred regionally in rivers that they thought were all different species. But it certainly is a very iconic shark in the Zambezi River. And many years ago, there were records of them in Malawi that had gone all the way up a tributary to the Zambezi River and were literally found in Malawi. But the Cahora Bassa Dam put a stop to that. The Cahora Bassa is about 600 kilometers up the Zambezi. And we still don't even know if there might still be Zambezi sharks upriver from the Cahora Bassa Dam. And one day I hope to get there and find out if that's indeed the case. But I think another example of habitat change making impacts on the habitat for these species along our coast. So yeah, certainly got an interesting history with our coastline and very iconic associated with the Zambezi River.
And are they still found as frequently in the Zambezi River?
Hard to get information. They are there, but I don't think that they are very frequent. Just speak, there's a fisheries management team that work up there, and when I've asked them about the numbers, that they seem to be quite few and far between. And likewise, I think sawfish used to be more abundant there. They've also seen significant decline there. There's quite a lot of fishing pressure there.
Well, awesome. I've seen more hands, so I'll be quiet. Thanks.
Thanks, Marty.
Thanks, Marty.
Good to see you again. Ryan, just want to say Marty is running encyclopedia, and if there's a talk, he can ask the questions. And we miss him if he's not here. He just recovered from COVID. Happy that you are back, Marty, alive and well. Good to have you on. Thanks. Then I'm just asking Bruce Mann, for whatever reason, it looks like he's keen to ask a question, but for now, Llewellyn Taylor's name is hand is up. Llewellyn, asking you to unmute, and then please come in.
Okay, I'm there. Yes, I've got a couple of, well, I could ask a couple of questions regarding osmoregulation, but maybe just keep it simple. What are the lowest salinity levels that the Zambezi sharks can actually tolerate in river systems? In fact, question would be, how far upstream could they go? That would be the first question.
Yeah, they could tolerate 0 salinity for years and years. They can live in totally fresh water, but they can also tolerate an extreme range of salinity. So from 0 to 200, they can tolerate essentially.
Oh wow, really? Sure.
Yeah,
that's incredible. Okay, and then then the second one is, I was just thinking, you know, we have so many impacts, upstream impacts, and I think I'm not too sure myself, but I was just thinking, if you look at the physicochemical characteristics of estuarine systems, surely there must be massive perturbations in that on a seasonal basis, particularly as a result of impacts upstream. So would that affect their life history in any way?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's why there's only very few systems that are suitable for them as pups, certainly, because they can obviously only tolerate a certain range of environmental variability, and I think that, as we found, one of the best indicators is for systems that are permanently open to the ocean, so that you have this interface, that they're able to move upstream if they have to, or downstream close to the sea if they have to. If there's a flood event, they might find salinity that's most tolerable. But that said, in the St. Lucia system, they survive years and years and years of permanent mouth closure and massive changes in environmental variables such as salinity. So they are pretty hardy, but in a way also depend on pretty specific, healthy, functioning estuaries.
Thank you. Oh, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Lou.
Thanks, Lou. Richard Masabedi, are you on to another question, or is your hands just hands still raised based on your previous question? Asking to unmute, Richard.
Thank you. It's related to the question I asked earlier, and I want to ask Ryan if they looked into the controls, or what controls the timing, because I understand the sharks have to meet, you know, it's important that the sharks meet at the same time with the prey, and the prey is not always at that site. it seems it migrates to the sides, the more like the breeding side. So the timing of the prey and the sharks is important, it's crucial. So did you look into what controls the timing, the movement in the prey side, in the fish, the important fish prey?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. There's still a lot of unknowns, but the sort of the best guess is that we know that one of their prey species is a gonochronistic broadcast spawner. In other words, that they're these fish that need to spawn together at the same place at the same time of year. So the major cues that they use are seasonality, so springtime, and then the phase of the moon. So they're very cued into a particular phase of the moon at a particular time of year at a particular site. So we saw that there was certainly some link between the prey timing and the arrival of the sharks driving their movement. But this didn't explain all of it. I think it explained about 65 to 80% of the sharks' presence, but we know that they're preying on other things too. So be able to really understand all of the things driving their movements, presence and absence is really a challenge, and we're only starting to understand it more.
Richard, anything else you would like to ask?
No, thank you.
Thank you. You are muted, Richard. I accept that you don't
Thank
have
you.
further questions.
Well,
Thanks, Richard.
I just want to say thanks, Ryan. It answers my question very well.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Richard. Lorraine, please unmute yourself and join us in the discussion. All the way from Chile, for those of you who have not met Lorraine.
My Wi-Fi went out for 5 minutes. So if you already answered this, I'll catch it. When, where, and how do you tag the sharks? Is it always in the estuaries, or is it in open water? When is there a specific time you do this, and how do you do it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, good question. So for the pups, we tag them in the estuary because they were their nursery, but all the adults we'll tag in the open ocean, and we'll focus all of our efforts in summer largely. And for those that are in the Breda River, for example, those are adults in the estuary at the peak of summer. For those that are swimming around the open ocean, we'll target sort of aggregation sites, but they're not easy to catch. I've spent probably years of my life now trying to catch them, and it's not easy. But essentially, you've got to catch them to implant these acoustic tags. But that's important because these tags can then last for 10 years. So it's worthwhile catching them. Once you've got them, they basically are kept in the water, flipped upside down, and they go into some sort of sonic immobility. So they basically just fall asleep upside down. You do a quick surgery, stick the tag in, stitch them up, and off they go.
So do you catch them in nets?
No, we use a hook and a line to catch them. So we use a hook that doesn't have a barb in it, and it's a circle hook, so it gets caught in the corner of the shark's mouth. That doesn't injure the shark, and just a hook and a line with a piece of bait, basically.
Okay, so I have another question. So do you recognize them? Do they recognize you as an individual?
I don't think that they recognize us, but it seems like some of them are trap happy. Some of them are definitely easier to catch than others. We see the same sharks at the same site year after year after year after year. We recognize a lot of them for sure, because they all come back for the same reasons to the same site. And I think some of them that are caught once are much more difficult to catch again, but others aren't. So they definitely each have their individual traits.
Interesting.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Lorraine.
Great talk.
Yeah. Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ryan. Susie, she gets to ask the last question. Then we're going to, Ruan will take us through the chat, or Pam, so that we can just attend to any questions that's in the chat. All right, Susie, and then thereafter, Ruan, you handle with Pam the chat. I think Pam can do it herself, no problem, eh? All right, Susie, we ask you to unmute, please. Susie Kennedy.
Hi, so this is more of a personal question, which is why I left it to the end. Is there a way or ways that you can recommend to get involved from literally the other side of the world? I'm about 2 hours north of a lake in northwestern Ontario, Canada, but marine megafauna is my passion.
Okay.
So
cool.
I'm just wondering if there's any way, like anything I'm missing that I can be involved with.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. That sounds great. I guess traveling is so difficult this day and age, but there's some well, in your part of the world there's a lot of guys doing some very interesting tagging and work, and if you pop me your email address in the chat there, I can email you some specific ideas, thoughts, and links and contacts.
Thanks. That would be awesome.
Thanks, Susie.
Great.
Thanks, Ryan. And then Pam, Ruan, over to you guys.
Lovely. Pam, are you there?
Yep. Hello.
Lovely. I mean, you've
Ryan,
been
there was
enough
just
to
one
try and
more.
answer all of them.
Yeah. There was just one question that's remained unanswered in the chat. So I don't know if you saw it there. It was Zambes are listed as vulnerable. Is there any way you can breed them and release pups in the wild? And then another question that was sort of tapped into earlier, and I don't know if you want to get into that or not, is just the whole issue relating to the opening of the estuary mouth. But I was saying sort of like a whole other topic. So I don't know if you want to touch on that at all, but maybe certainly look at the breeding question.
Okay, great. Thanks, Pam. Yeah, I think Zambezi sharks are difficult to just keep in captivity. Bruce and Judy Mann in this chat will tell you that they come with challenges in captivity, and breeding them, I'm not sure if that's been done, and releasing them in the wild would be a challenge in itself. I think it's certainly better to look at protecting the existing wild habitats, and I'm pretty sure that if we just focus on protecting the existing wild habitats that we have, that'll be sufficient to ensure the longevity of the species and the population along our coasts. But yeah, as you said, linking that into the St. Lucia question, it's easier said than done to protect systems like St. Lucia, because they're complex. There's so many potential conflicts with I guess coastal development, and St. Lucia is a study in how complex this sort of human impact can be on ecological integrity of a healthy system. But unless anybody's got some specific questions about St. Lucia, we just published a little paper about that, and I'm happy to pop that up on the website when it becomes available. It might answer more questions. Thanks, Pam.
Wonderful. There's I think Bruce just mentioned that better to protect wild habitats. Breeding for release is very complex and not yet done in our facility. Then I got one last question that was sent to me directly from Yigal Chetty. Do Zambezi sharks have any predators?
Yes. Yeah, well, you saw crocodiles are one of the predators.
Exactly. Cool,
and
cool.
yeah, other sharks eat, the Zambezi sharks eat themselves as pups too, and other large sharks will eat them as well as pups. But when they become big, obviously less and less eat them.
Of course. Brilliant. Cool. Thank you. Then I see Sean has a question there. Chris, I'm going to ask him to unmute.
Great, thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Ryan, from this, what you presented there, the move up to Mozambique seems to be following food and feeding. The move back is presumably for breeding and pupping. do we know what they want to do down at the breeder? Or was this, or is it a pupping site?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So yeah, just to start with the breeder question, the breeder is certainly for feeding because it's not a suitable nursery habitat because it gets too cold in winter. Globally, the minimum temperature for nursery is about 14, and once it hits 14, the pups can't survive, and the breeder gets much colder than 14 over winter. So I'm pretty sure that the adult sharks are targeting the abundant food sources in the Breeder River, and they're only able to do this in summer when the water temperature allows them to migrate all the way down the coast. And I think, interestingly, when they're there at the breeder, the sea temperature fluctuates a lot, but the river temperature stays sort of a constant 22, 23 degrees, which is perfect for these Zambezi sharks. So it's complex, I think, because the sharks at the Breeder River, I think, move up to northern Mozambique to pup, and then they come down to the breeder for food. But it might be that those sharks that pup in St. Lucia do something totally different. So different populations along the coast are doing different things. But when we first tagged the ones in the Breeder River, we thought it would make more sense for them just to swim up to St. Lucia and pup there. But they're going to northern Mozambique. So I think there's more than just obvious drivers of these sharks' movements. There are also populations, individuals with certain strategies of where to pup and where to feed. And only these sharks come back to these specific places and go back again. For example, at the Breeder River, it's the same sharks that come back every year, and which is fascinating. There's a lot of other questions around that too.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sean. Marty Jasper's got his hand up. Anything more in the chat, Pam? Ron?
Nothing yet, not from my side.
All right, then we're going to give Marty another opportunity. Sean, if you want to ask another question, I see your hand is up. So after Marty, and then we are gradually slowing down. I see we're down to 52 people. By the way, Ryan, 52 people is still a lot of people who's interested. It says a lot about your talk. Thank you for that. Marty?
Sorry, guys, there was one question that came through earlier from Andre. It came by email. I don't know if it got covered, but it was something similar, definitely was covered. The question was, land-based pollution and ocean warming have adversely affected coral reefs and coastal waters across the globe and habitat for marine animals. In the years that you have been monitoring the bull shark in Southern Africa, have you observed how these changes have impacted the migratory habits of the bull shark, its food supplies, sources, and other behavioral characteristics? Do you want me to read that again, or are you happy to cover?
Thanks, Pam. Yeah, no, it's a good question, and certainly remains largely unanswered because these sharks are such long-lived animals. 50 years. I mean, we only have been monitoring them for about 8 years now, and we're starting to understand some patterns of their migrations every year, but there's some variability in their migration patterns year after year, and it's difficult to tease out how large-scale things such as climate change, global warming might be impacting their movements. But I think certainly the habitats can be impacted. Key sites such as the Breeder River, St. Lucia Estuary have been impacted by things such as climate variability, droughts, human impact, water abstraction, agriculture, etc. And these all do impact their key sites and habitats, and in future, I think will probably influence their movement, ecology, and migration patterns.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Pam. Marty Jasper, after that, Sean, and then we will hear if there's any last questions in the chat, and then we will close down for the evening. Marty Jasper, I know that you will probably keep us busy for a while now. Over to you, Marty.
It's quick when I'm picking up on a few other things that were discussed in terms of salinity and temperature, and I'm just kind of interested physiologically about the Zambezi. What makes it able to withstand that huge range compared to another shark like a ragged tooth or a tiger? What makes it a Zambezi versus one of the others? I mean, characteristics. Maybe if you can kind of distinguish a little bit, that would be helpful too. And how can they live in completely fresh water and then 200 Ceylon and temperatures 14 to 22 compared to great white, which is, like, I presume, much colder in the Cape waters?
Yeah, good question, Mari. Yeah, the physiologically, the physiology that allows them to osmoregulate so effectively is a little complex, and I don't understand all the intricacies, but as far as I understand, they, through their liver, are able to regulate their salinity content. So through urea, basically, they're able to either expel more salt or retain more salt, hence maintaining their osmoelectric, well, their salinity balance more actively than another species such as a great white, which can't do this.
And are they the main one that's in any river? I mean, are any of the other South African sharks able to go up rivers?
There are some other sharks. I mean, for example, like raggies do go up some rivers, but their salinity tolerance is much, much smaller. And in fact, a lot of those sharks and rays that enter estuary systems would only be able to survive close to the mouth, where the salinity is close to that of the ocean. But Zambezi sharks are the only ones that can really tolerate this 100% fresh water. Yeah.
Well, thanks, man.
Sure.
Thanks, Muddy. Sean, we're asking you to unmute. No, I think Sean's hand might still be raised from a previous question. Pam, there you go. All right, great. Thanks, Sean.
If you compare to the other visitors on the Bera, so the wading birds also come in to feed, but they seem to not have a fixed departure date. So they're here to feed and they're spending however much time they need, delaying it if necessary to stock up on food and reserves for the flood. Do these sharks feed along the way, or are they also doing a reserve accumulation before they migrate?
Oh, thanks. Interesting question, Sean. I think two parts of interest in that question. First of all, do they feed along the way? I don't think they'd feed much because their migration along the coast is rapid. They are just passing all the other sites that we know Zambezi sharks occur at, and they're doing about 52 kilometers a day, just cruising up the coast. The movement's very directed, and when they get to the Breda, they stay there, and they leave, they depart all the way up the coast. But in terms of building up reserve, I think they are balancing trade-off between food reserves and tolerable environmental temperatures. So as it gets colder, they, I think, lose energy, but they also risk being cut off down there because they're only able to be there when the water's warm enough. And I think when the temperature starts to plummet in winter, I'd imagine they might die if they stayed there over winter. And the sort of departure is usually associated with warm ocean temperatures, and then they will quickly move up the coast. So I think that they do feed heavily, but I don't think that their energetic investment into migration is as great as a bird might be, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Sean. You okay with the answer? Anything else?
No, that's great. Thanks.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean. Over to the real host tonight, Ruan and Pam. You can handle the last few questions in the chat, and then we can close.
Thanks, Chris. Ron, so there's one request. Someone was just asking if they wanted to be involved in shark tagging. I know there's a lot of citizen science opportunities. I don't know if you meant more get into the science or citizen science, but I don't know if you want to drop a website or something like that.
Sure, I'll drop the link to the RE tagging site there. Yeah.
Brilliant. There's one question from Marcel Liebenhuizen. He's asking the limited lifespan of the satellite tracking devices. Is it due to battery life?
Yeah, it is due to battery life. And the technology, essentially, the one with the pop-up satellite tag battery life's an issue, but also the transmission of data is an issue, because that tag has to collect all of this data, geolocation, light, temperature, depth, and then transmit that data via satellites. And depending on where in the world, the satellite coverage is variable. So in where we are in South Africa, satellites only pass overhead a few times a day because it relies on the Argos satellite system. So I think there's only like 12 satellites that orbit the Earth, and the majority of their orbits are focused over Europe and the States. So we sort of get the dregs of the satellite coverage down here. And you can go online and check when you've got windows that it might be able to transmit data through, and it might only be a few hours in a day. So if you think about it, that tag has to pop up and that battery has to last the entire time to transmit all that data to the satellite. So if you've got coverage for 24 hours, it can transmit that data efficiently and use its battery well. But if it's starting, stopping, the battery is still going and getting burned, but essentially it can only transmit for about 2 weeks once it pops up. So it's better to have shorter deployments and get a more complete data sets, if that makes sense. And we hope the technology gets better.